I bought the property sight unseen at a foreclosure auction. It was a rustic A-frame cabin sitting on 40 acres of dense, untamed woodland in the northern corner of Maine. After years of the grinding city rat race, the extreme isolation was exactly what I craved. I planned to spend the entire summer renovating the neglected property and working remotely. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles down a rugged dirt logging road, and the closest actual town was a 40-minute drive. For the first few weeks, it was absolute paradise. My only regular contact with the outside world was the local mail carrier, a burly, weathered man named Arthur, who drove a battered, rust-spotted white Jeep. At first, our interactions were completely normal and brief. He'd drop off my packages, make fleeting eye contact, give a tight nod, and drive away, his tires kicking up a cloud of dust. The shift in his behavior was incredibly subtle at first. It started with my mail being delivered directly to my front porch, instead of the metal mailbox stationed at the end of my long, winding driveway. I didn't think much of it until I began finding small, unsolicited items left meticulously balanced on top of my letters. A perfectly smooth river stone, a bundle of dried sage tied with twine, a meticulously carved wooden figure of a deer that looked unsettlingly realistic. I tried to catch him to politely decline the gifts, but he always seemed to slip away just before I managed to open the heavy wooden door. Then the unannounced visits began. I'd be working at my desk by the large bay window and look up to see his white Jeep parked silently at the edge of the tree line, the engine idling. He wouldn't get out. He would just sit in the driver's seat, his silhouette perfectly still, staring intently at the cabin. When I stepped outside to confront him, waving my arms to get his attention, he would immediately throw the vehicle into reverse and speed off recklessly down the dirt road. The profound isolation I had previously romanticized suddenly felt like a suffocating cage. I drove into town, purchased heavy-duty deadbolts, and started keeping a loaded hunting rifle leaning against my nightstand. I tried calling the local sheriff's department, but without a direct verbal threat, they dismissed him as just a socially awkward local who was overly curious about the new city arrival. The true horror began when I realized he wasn't just watching from a distance anymore. One morning, I woke up to find the back door unlocked. I explicitly remembered throwing the deadbolt the night before. On the kitchen counter, next to my coffee maker, was a single, muddy footprint. Nothing was stolen, but my personal belongings had been subtly shifted. A hairbrush moved, a drawer left slightly ajar. The violation of my private sanctuary made me physically sick. The breaking point happened during a massive, violent, late summer thunderstorm. The rain was coming down in blinding sheets, turning the dirt road into an impassable, rushing river of mud. Around midnight, the power flickered and died completely, plunging the cabin into absolute blackness. I lit a kerosene lantern and sat rigid in the living room, listening to the wind howl through the pines. That's when I heard it. The heavy, deliberate, soaking wet sound of boots stepping onto the wooden planks of my front porch. I froze, my blood running cold. Someone slowly turned the front doorknob. It rattled violently against the locked deadbolt. Then, a heavy fist began pounding relentlessly on the solid oak door. I grabbed my rifle, my hands shaking uncontrollably, struggling to maintain my grip on the cold metal. I backed away into the narrow hallway, aiming the barrel directly at the entrance. "I know you're in there," a deep, raspy voice shouted over the deafening thunder. It was Arthur. "The storm is bad. Let me in. We belong together in here. I've prepared a place for us to weather the end." The sheer, unhinged delusion in his voice terrified me far more than the aggressive pounding. When the solid front door held firm against his weight, the heavy footsteps moved rapidly around the perimeter of the cabin. He was systematically checking the windows. A moment later, I heard the sharp, sickening sound of glass shattering in the kitchen. He had smashed the back window with a rock. I retreated further down the hall into the cramped bathroom, locked the flimsy hollow-core door, and climbed into the old cast-iron bathtub, training the rifle directly on the doorway. I could clearly hear his heavy boots crunching loudly on the broken glass on the linoleum floor. He was inside my house. He moved slowly from room to room, his wet boots squeaking, muttering frantic, unintelligible sentences to himself. He sounded intensely angry, feeling somehow betrayed by my locked doors. He stopped right outside the bathroom door. I held my breath until my lungs burned, my finger tight against the trigger. He stood there in the dark for what felt like an eternity, breathing heavily against the thin wood separating us. Then, a massive branch from a dying oak tree outside snapped under the sheer force of the gale and crashed onto the cabin's metal roof with a deafening, explosive bang. The sudden, violent noise must have spooked him, because I heard him panic, scramble hastily back down the hallway, and vault out the broken kitchen window. I stayed curled in that bathtub, shivering and clutching the rifle, until the sun finally came up and the storm passed. I hiked the 3 miles to my neighbor's house through knee-deep mud and called the state police. When they finally raided Arthur's property later that afternoon, they found a shrine dedicated to me in his damp basement. He had been photographing me through my windows for weeks using a telephoto lens. He had stolen items of my clothing straight off my laundry line. Worse, they found detailed, frantic handwritten journals outlining his absolute, delusional belief that we were married in a past life and that he needed to cleanse me of my city life so we could be together forever, isolated in the woods. Arthur was arrested without incident, found muttering in his shed. He was eventually deemed completely unfit to stand trial and was committed to a high-security psychiatric facility indefinitely. I sold the cabin a week later, taking a massive financial loss just to be rid of it, and moved back to a high-rise apartment in the center of the city. To this day, I still check my heavy deadbolts 3 times every single night, and I absolutely cannot look at a white Jeep without feeling my chest violently tighten in pure panic. I've always preferred the quiet. As a freelance architectural photographer, my job mostly involves capturing the forgotten beauty of decaying structures. Last November, I got a lucrative commission to photograph a supposedly cursed, long-abandoned church deep in the backwoods of the Appalachian Mountains. The pay was too good to pass up, and I figured it would be a quick day trip. I left my apartment before dawn, my SUV packed with camera gear, extra batteries, and a thermos of black coffee. By early afternoon, the GPS on my phone started losing its signal. The paved highway gave way to gravel, and soon I was navigating a narrow, winding dirt road swallowed by a dense canopy of towering pines. The sunlight struggled to pierce through the branches, casting long, unsettling shadows across the path. I hadn't seen another car for at least 2 hours. Needing to top off my tank and hopefully get some solid directions, I pulled into a small, run-down gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. The paint was peeling, and one of the gas pumps had a handwritten out-of-order sign taped to it. As I stepped out of my car, the silence was oppressive. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of my boots on the gravel. Inside, the air smelled of stale tobacco and motor oil. 3 men in worn overalls sat around a small folding table in the corner. They stopped talking the moment the bell above the door chimed. They didn't just look at me, they stared. It was a cold, calculating gaze, completely devoid of basic human curiosity. The man behind the counter, a gaunt figure with hollow cheeks, didn't utter a word as I paid for my gas. When I asked him if I was on the right track to the old hollow church, he just handed me my change, maintaining that same unnerving, dead-eyed stare. I quickly walked back to my car, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I could feel their eyes burning into my back until I drove out of sight. I decided the commission wasn't worth it. The daylight was fading fast, and the heavy atmosphere of the place was suffocating. I just wanted to get back to the main highway. I turned the SUV around at the next clearing and began the long drive back down the mountain. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the forest into absolute darkness. My headlights carved a narrow tunnel of light through the trees. I was making good time, anxious to leave that creepy gas station miles behind me. Then, as I rounded a sharp bend, I slammed on my brakes. The SUV fishtailed slightly on the loose dirt before coming to a complete stop, my heart pounding in my chest. Lying horizontally across the entire width of the road was a massive pine tree. It wasn't a fallen, dead wood. The base of the trunk had been cleanly sawed through. Fresh sawdust was scattered on the dirt. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone, but the screen displayed no service. I threw the car into reverse, desperately checking my rearview mirror. Before I could hit the gas, a blinding pair of high beams flicked on directly behind me. An old, rusted pickup truck had silently rolled up to my bumper, completely blocking my exit. The engine of the truck was off, but the lights were blinding. I was trapped. I locked my doors and rolled up my windows, my breathing turning into shallow gasps. From the glare of the headlights, I saw two silhouettes step out of the truck. They moved slowly, deliberately. In the dim reflection, I recognized the worn overalls from the gas station. One of them was holding something long and metallic, maybe a tire iron or a shotgun. I didn't wait to find out. I grabbed my flashlight, unbuckled my seatbelt, and shoved the passenger door open. I scrambled out of the SUV and threw myself into the dense underbrush, just as I heard the unmistakable sound of shattering glass from my driver's side window. I ran blindly into the forest, branches whipping my face and tearing at my jacket. I didn't dare turn on my flashlight. The darkness was my only cover. Behind me, I could hear heavy footsteps crunching through the dead leaves, accompanied by low, guttural whispers. They were fanning out, hunting me. I found a shallow ravine heavily obscured by thorny blackberry bushes. I slid down the muddy bank and curled myself into a tight ball, burying my face in my knees to muffle my erratic breathing. I stayed there, paralyzed by fear, for what felt like hours. The beams of their flashlights occasionally swept through the canopy above me, slicing through the darkness like predatory eyes. I could hear them communicating with sharp clicks of their tongues, a chilling, animalistic sound that made my blood run cold. Eventually, the sweeping lights vanished, and the footsteps faded into the distance. A long silence followed, broken only by the distant roar of a starting engine. I waited until the first light of dawn began to turn the sky gray before I dared to move. When I finally crept back to the dirt road, the rusted truck was gone. The sawed-off tree had been dragged to the side, leaving the path clear. My SUV was a wreck. All four tires were slashed, the windows were smashed, and my expensive camera equipment was missing. But my keys were still in the ignition, and my half-empty thermos was untouched. They hadn't wanted my car or my money. They had set a trap for me. I walked for 14 miles before catching a ride from a passing logging truck. I never reported the incident to the local authorities. There was no cell service, no evidence of who did it, and the absolute certainty in my mind that the people who run that town are exactly the people who police it. I still have nightmares about the cold, dead stares at that gas station, and the chilling realization of what happens when you wander too far off the map, into places where the road is a trap, and the locals are the hunters. The route between Blackwood County and the mainland hospital was a 40-mile stretch of crumbling asphalt that cut straight through the desolate salt marshes of the eastern seaboard. I drove a medical courier van, mostly transporting time-sensitive blood samples and organ transplant coolers on the graveyard shift. It was an incredibly lonely job, but the hazard pay was decent, and I usually found a strange sort of comfort in the unbroken solitude. That was until a Tuesday night in late October, when a thick, unnatural sea fog rolled in from the Atlantic, swallowing the marshland road whole. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet in a matter of minutes. My high beams were completely useless, violently bouncing off the dense, swirling white wall and blinding me. I had to reduce my speed to a painstakingly slow crawl, leaning forward over the steering wheel until my chest touched the plastic, my eyes straining just to catch a glimpse of the faded yellow lines painted on the road. The local radio stations had all died out an hour ago, replaced by a heavy, aggressive static that seemed to mimic the oppressive atmosphere outside. I eventually turned it off, leaving the rhythmic, hollow thud of my tires over the uneven pavement and the low mechanical hum of the van's engine as my only company. About halfway through the most isolated section of the marsh, things started to feel wrong. The yellow dividing lines suddenly disappeared. The road itself felt different, softer, as if the aged asphalt had somehow transitioned into packed, muddy earth without me noticing. I glanced down at my GPS display, but the digital map was completely blank, the cursor frozen helplessly on my location from at least 10 miles back. I brought the van to a slow halt and rolled down my window just an inch to get my bearings. The pungent, overwhelming smell of rotting vegetation and stagnant, brackish water flooded the cabin instantly. It was dead silent outside. No crickets, no wind rustling the tall reeds, no nocturnal wildlife whatsoever. Just a heavy, suffocating quiet that made my ears ring. Then I saw it. A faint, diffuse red glow pulsating weakly in the fog, directly ahead of me. I crept the courier van forward, my heavy work boot hovering anxiously over the brake pedal. The dull glow slowly resolved into the dirty taillights of a car parked diagonally across the narrow 2-lane road, completely blocking my path forward. It was a large, older model sedan, coated in a thick, dry layer of pale gray mud. The driver's side door was wide open, swinging slightly on its hinges, looking as if whoever was inside had bolted into the darkness in an absolute panic. A primal, sickening feeling of dread settled deep in the pit of my stomach. Every evolutionary instinct I possessed screamed at me not to step out of the relative safety of my vehicle. I slammed my hand onto the horn, releasing a harsh, continuous blaring sound that seemed to be swallowed instantly by the dense moisture in the air. Nobody appeared from the fog. Nothing moved. I carefully shifted the van into reverse, my plan being to back up slowly until I found a spot wide enough on the shoulder to turn the large vehicle around and take the long way back. As I looked up into the rearview mirror, the blood in my veins turned to ice. Standing dead center in the middle of the road, bathed in the sinister red glare of my own taillights, was a figure. It was impossibly tall, its limbs unnaturally elongated and thin. It wore a tattered, filth-covered yellow raincoat that hung loosely from its gaunt, skeletal frame. The oversized hood was pulled up, completely obscuring its face in shadow, but I could feel a heavy, predatory gaze locking onto me through the glass. It stood perfectly still, a silent, menacing sentinel waiting in the mist. Blind panic flared through my chest. I slammed the shifter back into drive and violently wrenched the steering wheel to the right, aiming the heavy van off the road and onto the narrow, unstable shoulder, desperately hoping to squeeze past the abandoned sedan. The right side tires immediately sank deep into the soft, treacherous marsh mud, slipping and spinning wildly. I hit the accelerator hard, pushing the engine to its limit. The van lurched forward forcefully, violently scraping against the rusted metal of the sedan with a deafening, sickening screech. but I barely managed to tear past the obstacle. I drove recklessly fast now, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, utterly terrified of looking in the rearview mirror. The fog seemed to thicken aggressively, pressing against the windshield like a physical weight. I drove blindly for what felt like 20 agonizing minutes, desperately expecting to see the welcoming sodium lights of the state highway in the distance. Instead, materializing out of the impenetrable white haze, a faint red glow appeared directly ahead of me. My heart stopped dead in my chest. It was the exact same dirty sedan, parked diagonally across the road. The driver's side door was still wide open. I slammed on the brakes with both feet, the heavy van skidding violently to a halt mere feet from the abandoned car. It was physically impossible. I hadn't turned around. I had driven perfectly straight the entire time. Trembling uncontrollably, I forced my eyes up to the rearview mirror. The impossibly tall figure in the yellow raincoat was standing there again, occupying the exact same spot directly behind my van. Only this time, it wasn't alone. 3 more figures, equally tall, impossibly thin, and physically distorted, were slowly emerging from the fog on the left side of the road. On the right side, 2 more identical silhouettes stepped out from the tall, dead marsh grass. They were moving toward the van with a slow, agonizingly disjointed gait, their limbs twitching and snapping erratically, like poorly controlled marionettes. They were boxing me in. I didn't think, I simply reacted. I threw the heavy van into reverse and floored the accelerator until it touched the floorboards. The engine roared furiously as I backed up at a terrifying speed, aiming straight for the center figure in the rearview mirror. I braced myself tightly for a horrific impact, but there was absolutely nothing. I just passed right through the empty space where the entity had been standing. I kept reversing blindly through the dense fog, the steering wheel trembling violently in my white-knuckled grip. I must have driven backward at 40 miles an hour for 2 straight miles before I suddenly hit a sharp fork in the road that I had completely missed before. I spun the wheel desperately, shifting back into drive, and tore down the new path. I didn't take my foot off the gas until I violently broke through the fog line and saw the brilliant, blinding neon lights of a 24-hour truck stop. I sat parked in the brightly lit lot for 3 hours, shivering uncontrollably, the doors locked and the engine still running hot. When dawn broke and I finally stepped out to inspect the damage to the van, the deep, jagged scratch from the sedan was clearly visible, scraped along the side panels. But tightly caught in the jagged metal of the rear bumper was a large piece of shredded, mud-stained yellow plastic. I walked into the diner, called my dispatcher, and quit the courier job right then and there. I have never driven anywhere near the salt marshes again, and to this day, I instinctively lock my doors the second a heavy fog begins to roll in.